Welcome everyone to this month's discussion on an interesting article published in the current issue of Neurogastroenterology and Motility Journal. My name is Dr. Purna Kashyap. I'm a gastroenterologist at Mayo Clinic, Rochester, Minnesota. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. John Pandolfino. Dr. Pandolfino is the Chief of Gastroenterology and Hepatology and the Hans Popper Professor in Department of Medicine at Northwestern University. He's also the current president of American Neurogastroenterology and Motility Society, one of the sponsoring societies for the journal, and the chair of the Neurogastroenterology and Motility section of American Gastroenterology Association Council. He has been the tour de force behind developing the Chicago classification since its very inception in 2009, providing manometric criteria for categorizing esophageal motility disorders. Dr. Pandolfino has spent much of his career investigating the pipes and valves of esophagus, as he says, and he joins us today to discuss findings from his recent publication in the Neurogastroenterology and Motility Journal on the latest iteration of Chicago classification for esophageal motility disorders based on high-resolution manometry. Welcome, John, and thank you for joining us for this chat today.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Before we get into this paper, I'm just curious how you got interested in this area.
I definitely was drawn towards gastroenterology and procedural fields as a student, and I leaned towards GI and was focused primarily on interventional maybe in the beginning. But really, after working with my mentor, Peter Karillis, and being introduced to physiology and the diagnostics and the tools, kind of fell in love with that. And I always joke around, and people have heard me say this before, but I come from a long line of plumbers and electricians, and this is really plumbing, and electrical motility activity. So I think I stayed in the family business.
Yeah, just a little bit more sophisticated now.
Yeah.
Going inside humans. All right, so as you've been involved with the Chicago classification since the very beginning, could you give us a brief history about how it came about, what was the motivation behind this, and how it has evolved over the serial iterations to where we are right now at Chicago classification version 4. I see it started with 4 authors, and now you report a working group of 52.
Yeah, it's interesting. It actually started in 2007 when Mark Fox, Arjen Bredenord, and I met in Paris at UEGW. And I think at that time we were a little frustrated with kind of the factions in the esophagus who were really focused on using only one technology. And there was a lot of competition and a lot of arguing. And it really was, in my mind, a hostile time in the esophagus. And we really wanted to build something that was much more collaborative because we felt that, this competition and these factions were really impeding progress. And we thought, there's this new technology that's really come out. And we saw that there was going to be a lot of opportunity to improve the field, both in terms of research and clinical practice. And that's where we really started it. And we formalized this in 2008. We had our first real meeting. That led to the first publication. But the first mention of Chicago classification was actually in a paper by Fox and Bredenord, early in 2007. And it certainly evolved. Now we have 52 members of the last iteration.
It's amazing. Let's move maybe on. Can you expand a little bit more on the working group and how these members are selected? And what is the methodology that was used for the development of this version of the Chicago classification, and how this methodology, if at all, differs from the previous versions?
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, it essentially started out as a club. We just a couple of people, who were very interested, invited a few other people. But as we moved forward, even towards 3.0 and now with 4.0, we knew it needed to be more rigorous, and we needed to be more diverse. So this round, we really engaged with the various international motility societies across the Federation so that they would have an opportunity to nominate people. And certainly we were pushing for diversity, both in terms of gender and motility expertise and where they were located throughout the globe. So we had a really nice group from 5 continents, 20 countries. And it was really a great experience to work with so many different people. And I think the fact that we were so engaged with the motility societies really gave it, in my mind, much more credibility.
That's great. And for our listeners who don't know about the Federation and they used a different reference, this is the Federation of Neurogastroenterology and Motility, which includes the American Neurogastroenterology Motility Society, the European Society of Neurogastroenterology and Motility, the American Neurogastroenterology Society of Australia, the Asian Neurogastroenterology Society, and the South American Neurogastroenterology and Motility Society. Did I miss any among these, John?
I think you got it. And I think we were able to allow these societies to pick people, and then once we had our group, we really focused on using the formally validated RAND appropriateness method, the RAM method, and with COVID coming through this, it was a little bit of a hiccup, but we were able to be nimble and shift to an online virtual meeting platform so that we could finish this. It took us a little bit longer than we expected. We were going to unveil it in Chicago at DDW, but unfortunately that didn't happen, and we had to reboot, and we were able to get it done at a reasonable pace given COVID.
Yeah, no, this is pretty remarkable to get these many people together on a virtual platform. So let's move on to the specifics. What are the updates to the high resolution manometry procedure and the thresholds in the current version of Chicago classification, and why were these changes important?
Yeah, I think there's been some dramatic changes, and I think the first one that to focus on is really the protocol. When we first started doing this, we were really focused on just classifying an esophageal motility pattern. And given the fact that the conventional standard was 10 supine swallows, we really focused on this. But what we realized very quickly was that number one, people did things very differently across the world, the globe, and also that some of the metrics would change based on positions, and specifically the IRP. In fact, probably the impetus for this was the fact that the IRP could pretty much normalize if you change position. So what you're going to see now in Chicago 4.0 is this much more fluid and interactive protocol, where certainly we start with 10 swallows, and you can start in the supine or the upright position. But then once you're done with those 10 swallows, you're really moving through this process where you're actually trying to figure out what's going on with the patient, and are these measurements and metrics valid. So we would then shift the position. We would also use provocative swallows like multiple rapid swallows, the rapid drink challenge, to also once again evaluate the function, look to see if the IRP either improved or got worse. Is there evidence of obstruction? Is there evidence of abnormal peristaltic response? So for instance, if you had someone who had weak peristalsis, did they have a peristaltic reserve or augmentation after multiple rapid swallow? So it's a much more fluid protocol where decisions are made, during the actual evaluation, but you could go through the entire protocol and use all of these maneuvers and then go back and evaluate the patient. But we left it open so that people had some flexibility that, if you see an achalasia patient and you diagnose them with achalasia with the first 10 swallows, you really don't want to put that person through a rapid drink challenge if the diagnosis is so clear. So I think there's a lot more flexibility. There's a lot more interaction with this protocol. And I think people are going to like this because, once again, they can adapt it to their practice.
And I see on the screen, that's the first red box, which is step 2, which is change position. Is that what you were referring to right now?
Yeah, so this is actually just a draft comparison. It's not the actual, Chicago 4.0 totally, but yeah, it gives you that flavor of, you're going to start with those 10 swallows, and then after that, once you've made that evaluation, you're going to shift positions so that you can see whether or not the patient, is going to generate that same IRP value. Is it going to improve? Is it going to get worse? And then you will go through that. And if you haven't figured out what's going on, we leave it open in the end for some more provocative swallows. And that could even be, a solid test meal if you're really concerned about dysphagia and obstructive symptoms. If you're concerned about regurgitation, you may go into a rumination postprandial meal. Have the patient, utilize a meal that would cause them to have regurgitation. And then, of course, we also bring in some provocative pharmacologic maneuvers if that's available. We don't make any of these a qualification for the diagnosis, or an absolute requirement, but they're there to help you formulate the diagnosis, because many times when you're doing this, you don't get a conclusive diagnosis and you're having to work around and getting complementary tests to get a conclusive diagnosis in the end.
Great, and for our listeners, I wanted to clarify that you also wrote a mini review which summarizes the changes between the third and fourth version of Chicago classification, and the figures there highlight what the changes are, because obviously when you're listening to the podcast, you can see these figures, but you can always refer to that mini review.
Yes.
And a critical update to the Chicago classification version 4 was within the disorders of esophageal-gastric junction function, and it was a clarification on what constitutes clinically relevant esophageal-gastric junction outlet obstruction. Can you elaborate on this and the other changes within this group of esophageal motility disorders?
Yeah, I think this was very important. Achalasia really didn't change much going from 3.0 to 4.0, but EGJ outflow obstruction was really problematic. The IRP is a metric that is very sensitive. And I think people sometimes view it too much like a dichotomous line in the sand, where if it's above 15, it's abnormal, below 15, it's normal. And really what it's giving you is a probability of abnormality. It's not once again, a dichotomous value. It's not even linear, really. It's more of a logarithmic probability. So, if you have an IRP of 50, certainly that's more impressive than an IRP of 17. But 17 can be normal or abnormal, and we have to keep that in the context of this process. And that's why it was really important for us to say that we needed to see both an abnormal IRP in the upright and supine positions in order for it to be a manometric diagnosis of EGJ outflow obstruction. Now, in order to have a conclusive diagnosis of EGJ outflow obstruction, which would allow you to have an actionable therapeutic or intervention, that does require complementary testing. So we basically state that a manometric diagnosis of EGJ outflow obstruction is always inconclusive until you prove otherwise with complementary testing. And those complementary tests are either an esophagram, potentially a functional lumen imaging probe showing obstruction. And we also support the utilization of these provocative swallows to increase your pretest probability or your likelihood that this is a real obstruction. And I think this was a really important part, and probably the most crucial update that comes out of 4.0.
Great. Yeah, I agree that is a big challenge here. And what are the key updates to the disorders of peristalsis that you have?
Yeah, so one thing that we didn't have a lot of great data on jackhammer, hypercontractile, and spasm over the period since 3.0. And one thing that we did, we changed the nomenclature a little bit. We basically made the group of hypercontractile disorders, meaning that these are the patients that have an above normal contractile vigor based on DCI, and we put jackhammer as a variant or a component of these hypercontractile swallows that had that repetitive contractile pattern, because we do know that those patients tend to have the worst dysphagia. But really not a big change in that particular profile of motility disorders. Similarly, spasm stayed very much the same, except for the fact that we really focused on, the issue of the fact that the CDP was difficult to localize, and the distal latency interval was sometimes difficult to measure. And you really needed to take this into the context of the clinical scenario. So if you found someone with some kind of weak swallows that were a little bit premature, and this was in the context of someone being evaluated for GERD, we made people take pause in that and calling that spasm and treating these patients with an actionable intervention focused on spasm. Really, the biggest change, though, in the disorders of peristalsis has come from ineffective esophageal motility. We kind of removed that fragmented swallow part that we had last time, because it really didn't matter too much, and it really fell within the construct of ineffective esophageal motility. So now ineffective esophageal motility combines both the weak swallows with a DCI less than 450, and then also the fragmented swallows with a defect of 5 centimeters or more. And what we did was we made the criteria for IM much more stringent. So now you need greater than 7 out of 10 or greater than 70% of your swallows to be either ineffective or fragmented, or potentially 50% failed swallows. So now this really makes the criteria for ineffective esophageal motility much more, in my mind, refined, so that it really delineates abnormalities in bolus transit and also abnormalities that may predispose people to reflux disease. So a lot more restriction in terms of that peristaltic classification.
Great, and yeah, as you mentioned, this is an evolving field, and we also had a nice set of articles as well as a mini review in our November issue of the Neurogastroenterology and Motility, which highlighted hypercontractile esophagus, and it's clear that it's still a tough nut to crack.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm going to steal that one from you, Prerna.
Well, it's the title of the paper, so yeah. You'll steal it from the authors.
I'll have to reference it.
Yeah. So the Chicago classification version 4 provides guidance to enable better characterization of the esophagogastric junction complex. Why was this important, or why is this an improvement?
Well, you know, it's interesting because when I learned manometry, you know, the first thing that you did was measure basal LES pressure and look for a hernia. And that kind of got lost in the Chicago classification because we really weren't focused primarily on reflux. We were really focused primarily on dysphagia in the Chicago classification. And we felt that, you know, given the amount of interest in this area, we sought to really introduce this back into the context of this. And to be honest, I really do think that small hernias in EGJ anatomy is extremely important in dysphagia. So we felt it would be important to give people better guidance. There had been mention of EGJ morphology and these new metrics loosely around the Chicago classification. We just figured we would formalize this, realizing that this was also an area that needed a lot more work. But we felt pretty comfortable that we could at least define hiatus hernia by the LES-CD separation, the crural diaphragm, lower esophageal sphincter separation. And we also felt that there was at least some decent data focused on the, you know, the EGJ-CI, which is, you know, the DCI of the EGJ, that allowed you to predict whether or not someone was predisposed to gastroesophageal reflux or abnormal gastroesophageal reflux. But this doesn't discount. I still, you know, in my practice, I still measure the end expiratory LES pressure because I do think that has clinical relevance, despite the fact that it's not clearly mentioned in Chicago 4.0.
Great, and I know the January issue will have the actual Chicago classification and the recommendations, but there's a lot of work which goes behind this, and I understand that you plan to submit more of the methods-based papers over the next few months also. Is that right?
Yeah, so you know, it would be almost impossible to put all of this work into one manuscript. So as we plan this out, we would provide the first paper, which would be an overall description of the Chicago classification, but then we're allowing each working group to present each month their work, focus on the protocol, this new EGJ metric section, and we'll go through each one of these diagnostic classifications in much more detail in subsequent versions and articles in NGM. And I think it really gives each group and working group an opportunity to also discuss the controversies that they addressed. And you know, there was not 100% consensus, and we still feel like there's a lot more work to be done here. And that's the beauty of the Chicago classification process, is that this has always been, you know, a work in evolution, and we're never quite done. And even as we finish 4.0, we've already been looking to the future. What are the things that we couldn't accomplish in 4.0 that we need to accomplish by 5.0? And I think that's one of the nice things about this process.
Well, since you opened the door to that, I know it's a bit early as we're just releasing version 4, but if you were to guess where you are headed next in terms of Chicago classification 5, are you thinking that will be another iteration of improving manometric interpretation, or do you think it might be something more, you know, for example, combined with clinical or endoscopic, or these complementary diagnostic tests or serum markers, or, you know, I'm just throwing ideas out there, but I'm wondering how you envision the next version of Chicago classification.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was surprised by was that we didn't have enough data to really bring impedance into Chicago classification yet. And, I don't think we were there, despite the fact there was great work coming out of the Australian group, Tahir, and, Ravi's work in San Diego and a few others. And we've been working on it, at Northwestern. We really weren't there yet, but I think you're going to see impedance become an important part of 5.0, especially when it focuses on bolus transit and some of the mechanics of bolus transit. I think there's also going to be a great opportunity for artificial intelligence and machine learning to help us, number one, standardize our evaluation of these criteria, but also to explore different variants of these groups. There are a lot of cluster analyses that can be done to further refine some of these classifications. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that be implemented. I also think I was very happy with the introduction of thinking about things outside of just the manometric procedure and thinking about the other clinical aspects of the case. And I think, endoscopy is something that, we will need to think about in terms of, our pre-test probability, because there are people who have talked long about this. And Alan Cameron is someone, from the Mayo Clinic. I still have his paper up in my office, where he talks about, diagnosing motility with endoscopy. And I think endoscopy has a lot to add to the evaluation of motility. And I think Alan brought that out, over 20 years ago. And I think we need to bring all of this information together to get to the best diagnosis. And I think that's the end result for the Chicago classification. That's great. And it's a lot of exciting things to look forward to. And like you mentioned, everything is a work in progress, but it's amazing to think that you guys have already laid out some groundwork for the next version of Chicago classification. Yes. Any final thoughts before we sign off? No, I just, once again, I just want to thank everybody for participating. The working group was exceptional, and through the COVID pandemic, they really rallied together. Doing a virtual meeting with 52 members on the call, a Zoom meeting, was not as difficult because everyone was so respectful and really collaborative. And once again, this could not have been done without, the 52 members and all of the people working together, and especially Reina Yadlapati, who really was the anchor that kind of kept everything together, really organizing everybody and keeping everybody on task. So once again, I think, this really was, a great collaborative team effort. Great. With that, I'd like to thank Dr. Pandolfino for taking the time today to explain and give us a backstage view for the Chicago classification version 4. As you mentioned, there's a lot more to come as we look ahead in the months, talking about individual working groups from this classification. This will be published in the January issue of Neurogastroenterology and Motility in 2021. And I'd also like to thank our listeners for joining in for this interesting discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.